It is the evening of July 11th, 2015. In the northeastern corner of a cell inside the Altiplano Federal Penitentiary, Mexico's most secure correctional facility, a man walks slowly into his private shower. The cameras that monitor him around the clock are positioned to cover every inch of the cell. But the shower stall has a low partition wall, and for a few moments, the man is out of frame. Those moments stretch into minutes. The guards notice. They wait a moment longer than they should, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of something else entirely, and then they move toward the cell. They find nothing. The clothes are still there. The bed is made, the TV is on. In the floor of the shower, barely visible, is a rectangular seam cut into the concrete. Below it, a shaft drops several meters into the ground. At the bottom of that shaft, there is a tunnel. The most wanted man in Mexico has, for the second time in his life, walked out of a maximum security prison. His name is Joaquín Archivaldo Guzmán Loera. The world knows him as El Chapo. To understand how a man reaches that shower, you have to go back much further. Not to the prison, not even to the cartel. You have to go back to the land itself. The Sierra Madre Occidental runs down the western spine of Mexico like an old scar, where it meets the states of Sinaloa, Chihuahua, and Durango. The terrain becomes something genuinely hostile, a maze of deep ravines, mountain plateaus, and river valleys that have historically been difficult for any central authority to control. This region has a name. It is called the Golden Triangle. The name refers not to gold, but to something more economically potent. The soil and climate of the Golden Triangle are well suited to the cultivation of opium poppies and cannabis. That has been true for well over a century, and it was true long before any cartel existed to take advantage of it. By the early 20th century, Chinese immigrant communities in northwestern Mexico had established early drug trade networks, supplying opium derivatives that moved north toward the United States. From 1916 onward, these networks expanded. By the 1920s, they had become a serious commercial concern. Then, between 1926 and 1940, a wave of nationalist violence drove the majority of Mexico's Chinese population out of the country. Mobs, backed in some cases by local authorities, blamed immigrant communities for the spread of drug use and moral corruption. The Chinese networks were dismantled, but the trade itself did not end. What happened instead was a reorganization. By the time Joaquín Guzmán was born in 1957, the drug economy of the Golden Triangle had evolved into something more sophisticated and more deeply embedded in the structure of the Mexican state. It was no longer an immigrant enterprise or a purely criminal one. It had become a system, a managed hierarchy involving farmers at the bottom, traffickers in the middle, and government officials at the top who collected revenue under the pretext of law enforcement. Corruption was not a flaw in the system. Corruption was the system. Into this world came the Guzmán family. The hamlet of La Tuna sits in the municipio of Badiraguato in Sinaloa. It is a small, isolated place, the kind of settlement that exists largely because the mountains make it difficult to leave. Joaquín Guzmán was born there on April 4, 1957, the son of Emilio Guzmán Bustillo and María Consuelo Loera Perez. His father managed a modest cattle herd inherited from his own parents. Accounts of what Emilio Bustillo was like as a father differ depending on who is asked. Some depictions are harsh, describing a man prone to drink and physical punishment. Members of El Chapo's family have pushed back on these characterizations, describing him instead as simply absent, more interested in other pursuits than in hard work or fatherhood. Whatever the precise truth, the dominant figure in Guzmán's early domestic life appears to have been his mother, María Consuelo, who was remembered by those who knew her for her energy, her reliability, and her willingness to work. He was the second of her children, growing up with two sisters, Armida and Bernarda, and four brothers, Miguel Ángel, Aureliano, Emilio, and Arturo. La Tuna was not a comfortable place to grow up poor. The Mexican government's relationship with the rural communities of Sinaloa was, at best, transactional. At worst, it was violent. Throughout his childhood, Guzmán would witness something that left an impression lasting long into his adult years. Soldiers arriving after dark in rural hamlets, intimidating farmers and demonstrating repeatedly and without ambiguity that the law was not a protection but an instrument of power. His sister would later recall that armed troops regularly came through their village and that her brother had several confrontations with them, on at least some occasions being beaten in front of his mother. What a child learns from that kind of experience is not simply that authority is corrupt. It is something more specific. It is that power operates outside the rules that are presented to you, and that if you want to survive, you had better learn how power actually works rather than how it claims to work. Guzmán appears to have absorbed this lesson early. As a boy, relatives described him as entrepreneurial in a way that stood out in his surroundings. He would cut paper into rectangles, fold them into bundles the way banknotes were bundled, and ask his mother to store them. He sold oranges along the road between La Tuna and a neighboring settlement. On Sundays, when visiting family, he wore cheap gold-colored chains, the kind that turned his skin greenish, because they approximated the appearance of wealth he intended one day to have, in fact. He helped with the cattle. He played volleyball. He watched and he waited. He was, by most accounts, a short boy. He would become a short man, 5 feet 6 inches, with brown eyes, black hair, and a heavy mustache that he wore throughout most of his adult life. He had a noticeable Sinaloa accent and a mild stammer when he spoke quickly. In later years, those who knew him professionally described someone who was unexpectedly calm in business discussions, methodical, patient, focused on the specific details of transactions, even as the broader enterprise around him operated in organized violence. He was not educated in any formal sense. His literacy was limited, and yet the people who dealt with him in his peak years consistently described a man who understood systems, who thought in terms of logistics and incentives, and who was capable of long-range planning in a field that punished impatience. His first entry into the drug trade came through his father, working plots growing illegal plants. After that, he moved to the town of Badiraguato, looking for more. The organization Guzmán joined in his early career was the Guadalajara Cartel, then the dominant trafficking organization in northwestern Mexico and one of the most powerful criminal enterprises in the country. It was led by Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, a man of a different generation, more politically connected, more comfortable operating in the shadowed overlap between organized crime and government. Gallardo had understood something that earlier traffickers had not, that an organization operating at scale required relationships, not just territory. He cultivated officials. He maintained order within his own ranks. He ran a business or something that resembled one. Guzmán entered this structure as a young man in his early 20s and rose quickly through it. He was not the most visible figure. He was not the wealthiest, but he was regarded as reliable and efficient, which in that environment counted for a great deal. The late 1970s and early 1980s were a turbulent period for the drug trade in Mexico for several interconnected reasons. Demand in the United States had expanded dramatically through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, a consequence of cultural shifts, the growth of recreational drug use, and the disruption of older supply networks. In 1972, a major heroin pipeline running from Southwest Asia through France to the United States, the so-called French Connection, had been dismantled by law enforcement. The demand that pipeline had served did not disappear. It redirected, and Mexican production expanded to meet it. At the same time, the Mexican federal government, with encouragement and funding from the American Drug Enforcement Administration, launched a major eradication campaign beginning in 1975 called Operation Condor. The operation was sweeping and, at the ground level, often indiscriminate. Crops were destroyed, legal and illegal alike. Suspected traffickers were killed or imprisoned without anything resembling due process. Federal and state officials competed openly for control of bribe revenues. The violence was considerable, and it landed hardest on the rural communities of Sinaloa that had been cultivating these crops for generations. For Guzmán, the practical effect of Operation Condor was to push him out of Sinaloa for a period. He relocated to Guadalajara, where he operated under Félix Gallardo's umbrella as a mid-level trafficker. In 1984, he moved again, this time to Zacatecas, the central Mexican state where he came under the influence of Juan José Esparragoza Moreno, a figure who would remain important to Guzmán for the rest of his career and who would come to be known by the alias El Mayo. Then the entire structure of Mexican organized crime shifted. In 1985, a DEA agent named Enrique Camarena, known to colleagues as Kiki, was kidnapped in Guadalajara. He was tortured and killed. The operation had been authorized at the highest levels of the Guadalajara cartel. The American response was immediate and sustained. Over the following 4 years, the DEA and its Mexican counterparts systematically dismantled Gallardo's organization. By 1989, the man who had dominated the trade was in prison, and his empire had fragmented. That fragmentation created opportunity. For men like Guzmán, who had been operating in the middle tiers of that structure, the question now was whether they could hold and expand the pieces they controlled. Guzmán could, and he did. By 1989, the organization that would become the Sinaloa Cartel existed in modest form, approximately 25 employees, offices in Guadalajara and a border town called Agua Prieta in Sonora, and a single supply line that ran south to Colombia. The mechanism at the heart of that supply line was an underground tunnel. The entrance was inside a house on the Mexican side of the border. A pool table sat in one room. Beneath the pool table, a hydraulic lift, activated by a switch, raised the table away to reveal a shaft going down into the ground. At the bottom of the shaft, there was a cart on a track. The cart was loaded with product, and then a rope pulled it approximately 200 feet under the international boundary to a warehouse on the American side, in Douglas, Arizona. There, a second hydraulic mechanism, this one disguised as a drainage grate, lifted the goods to floor level. The tunnel was not glamorous, but it worked, and it worked well. More than 3 tons of product moved through it each month in the early years. What made the operation valuable was not primarily the volume, it was the speed. Guzmán had recognized that the bottleneck in cross-border drug trafficking was time. Every hour product sat at the border was an hour of exposure. His tunnel moved inventory faster than competitors who relied on surface crossings. The Colombian suppliers, who were then the dominant producers, took notice. They began preferring Guzmán. They gave him a name, El Rapido. The money that followed was, for a man who had sold oranges by the road as a boy, almost abstract in scale. He bought a mansion valued at $10 million. He bought a private zoo stocked with large cats. He bought 4 private jets, which he used to travel to casinos and conduct business. He bought hundreds of luxury automobiles. He gave his trusted associates diamond-encrusted Rolex watches and cars as Christmas bonuses. It lasted until May 17, 1990, when American law enforcement raided the warehouse in Douglas, Arizona, and discovered the tunnel. With his primary pipeline gone and his reputation with the Colombians at stake, Guzmán needed a replacement immediately. His organization devised one. Narcotics were packed into cans of chili peppers, the strong odor masking the scent from detection dogs, and transported across the border concealed in commercial trucks. The point of entry shifted westward into Baja California. That shift would prove expensive in a different way. Baja California was the territory of the Arellano Felix family, the Tijuana Cartel. Under the conventions of Mexican organized crime, any trafficker using another organization's routes owed that organization a tax, a proportion of revenue in exchange for access and protection. Guzmán declined to pay. The refusal was not purely about money. The relationship between the Sinaloa organization and the Tijuana cartel had been deteriorating for years over a series of specific grievances. One of them involved Hector Palma, a close associate of Guzmán's, whose wife and young children had been killed by a Venezuelan trafficker with connections to the Arellano Felix brothers. Another involved a shooting at a party in 1988, in which Ramón Arellano Felix killed a friend of Guzmán's in front of witnesses. These were not forgotten. By the early 1990s, the tensions between the two organizations had moved beyond dispute and into open conflict. In 1992, the two sides encountered each other by chance while driving through Guadalajara. Ramón Arellano Felix took the opportunity to open fire. Guzmán barely escaped. He responded later that year by sending gunmen to Puerto Vallarta, where Ramón was attending a party at a nightclub, but the target was warned in time and left before the attack. The situation escalated further in May 1993. Guzmán was at the international airport in Guadalajara, preparing to depart. Tijuana gunmen, led by Ramón Arellano Felix, ambushed the motorcade as it approached the departure's terminal. The vehicles were hit with sustained gunfire. Guzmán ran through the terminal, down service roads, eventually flagging down a taxi on a highway outside the airport. He was not the only casualty of the ambush. Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, one of the most senior figures in the Mexican Catholic Church and a man beloved by a considerable portion of the population, had arrived at the airport in a vehicle similar to Guzmán's at approximately the same time. He was killed in the crossfire. The killing of a cardinal, whether accidental or otherwise, was of a different order of magnitude than any prior incident. Within days, both Guzmán and the Arellano Felix brothers were among the most wanted individuals in Mexico. A reward of $5 million was placed on their heads. Their faces were on every television screen in the country. Guzmán went to ground first in Mexico City, then moved south toward Central America. He was arrested in Guatemala shortly after his arrival there. He was extradited to Mexico and transferred to the Federal Center for Social Readaptation, a maximum security facility outside Mexico City in Almoloya de Juarez, where he was sentenced to 20 years for drug trafficking, corruption, and the killing of the cardinal, though his direct role in the cardinal's death was, and remains, disputed. He was then transferred to Puente Grande, a high-security facility on the outskirts of Guadalajara. He had been in prison before. He would manage. Within a relatively short time of his arrival at Puente Grande, the institution began to operate differently around Guzmán than it did around everyone else. Prison officials were paid. Guards were paid. The warden was paid. In return, Guzmán received access to a private chef to his choice of food, hamburgers, lobster, whatever he wanted, to civilian clothing, to mobile phones, and, in time, to visits from his wives. He ran his organization from inside. His second-in-command on the outside, Miguel Ángel Martínez, continued to manage operations. His brother Arturo, known as El Pollo, served as a key liaison. For a time, they visited him in prison directly to discuss business. When that became too dangerous, as intelligence suggested that rival gunmen from the Tijuana Cartel were active in the Guadalajara area, communications shifted to a brother-in-law who visited regularly. For 8 years, this arrangement held. Then, two things changed. First, an investigation into corruption at Puente Grande began to gain serious momentum. The special privileges that had made prison tolerable were at risk. Second, and more significantly, on January 18, 2001, Mexico's Supreme Court approved a decree that would substantially ease the extradition of Mexican nationals to the United States. For a man who had been careful about maintaining any kind of legal foothold in Mexico, the prospect of an American prison, where there would be no bribes, no phones, no chefs, was a different proposition entirely. He moved the following day. At 8 o'clock in the evening, on January 19, 2001, Guzmán climbed into a laundry cart. A guard he trusted, who was known by the nickname El Chito, pushed the cart through 8 security checkpoints to the outer gate of the prison. Outside, Guzmán got into the trunk of a waiting car. The car was checked at the final security point. The guard waved it through. The car drove to a staging location. A helicopter took him toward Mexico City. There, he was met by Ismael Zambada Garcia, El Mayo, who had been his closest and most enduring partner for years. Guzmán held a newspaper over his face at a toll booth during the drive so he wouldn't be recognized. Within days, he was back in the mountains of Sinaloa. The months immediately following the escape were a period of reorganization. In a series of meetings at a remote ranch, Guzmán met with the core figures of his alliance, El Mayo's brother, the Beltran Leyva brothers. He laid out a vision for what came next. The Sinaloa Cartel, battered but not destroyed, would be rebuilt. Roots would be reestablished. Rivals would be addressed. The Tijuana Cartel had been weakened in the years of his imprisonment, but it had not been finished. Guzmán set about finishing it. In February 2002, Ramon Arellano Felix, the man who had shot at him in traffic, organized the airport ambush and represented the most direct threat to his life for more than a decade, was killed by law enforcement officers working in coordination with El Mayo's people. He was pulled over for a traffic violation. The following month, Benjamin Arellano Felix, Ramon's brother and the organizational head of the Tijuana network, was arrested with DEA assistance. The Tijuana Cartel did not recover from the loss of both brothers in consecutive months. It fragmented over the following years into something much less formidable. Having settled that account, Guzmán turned his attention eastward. The Gulf Cartel operated out of Tamaulipas, the state that borders Texas in northeastern Mexico. It controlled several important smuggling corridors that Guzmán began using without arrangement or payment. The mechanism was elegant. Product was concealed in the walls of tanker cars, which were then filled with vegetable oil, attached to a train, and moved north toward Chicago and New York. At the destination, the tankers were diverted to a warehouse, where workers broke open the wall compartments with sledgehammers. The system required fewer people than tunnel operations, was harder to detect, and moved very large volumes of product efficiently. But Oziel Cárdenas Guillén, the Gulf Cartel's leader, was not inclined to accept the intrusion. Cárdenas Guillén was a particular kind of figure in the history of Mexican organized crime. He had earned the nickname Friend Killer through the specific nature of some of his most notable acts. More relevantly, he commanded Los Zetas, a unit of former military personnel, including Special Forces veterans, who had been trained and organized with a level of discipline that set them apart from the enforcement arms of other organizations. Los Zetas were not simply violent. They were structured, they were effective, and they were prepared to operate in ways that civilian criminal enterprises typically were not. Guzmán recognized the threat. With the assistance of Arturo Beltrán Leiva and a former high school football player turned lieutenant named Edgar Valdez Villarreal, he assembled his own paramilitary force, Los Negros. The conflict that followed, centered on the border city of Nuevo Laredo, was among the most openly brutal episodes in recent Mexican history. Bodies were left in public places. Street battles involved weapons and tactics that seemed to belong to military conflict rather than criminal rivalry. In the end, it was a costly stalemate. Los Negros could not dislodge Los Zetas. Guzmán made the pragmatic decision to withdraw from Tamaulipas rather than continue absorbing the losses. He redirected his ambitions towards Ciudad Juarez. Ciudad Juarez sits directly across the Rio Grande from El Paso, Texas. It is one of the most significant crossing points on the entire border, a city through which enormous volumes of legitimate trade and illegitimate trade have always flowed simultaneously. Whoever controlled the smuggling routes through Juarez controlled access to one of the most valuable corridors in North America. Those routes were held by the Juarez Cartel, led by Vicente Carrillo Fuentes. The relationship between the Juarez and Sinaloa organizations had historically been cooperative. They shared roots, they shared interests. That changed in the early 2000s, when Guzmán, freshly escaped from prison and focused on reasserting his position, began cutting Juarez out of arrangements they had previously shared. The break became irreparable in September 2004, when Guzmán ordered the killing of a senior member of the Carrillo Fuentes family. Juarez responded by arranging the killing of El Pollo, Guzmán's brother Arturo, inside his Mexican prison cell. The war that followed was different from the Tamaulipas conflict in one specific respect: the weapons. Guzmán had, by this point, established a relationship with a hitman named José Antonio Torres Marufo, who had previously worked for the Juarez organization before switching sides. Torres Marufo had contacts in El Paso who could provide military-grade firearms from the American side of the border, AR-15 semi-automatic rifles, AK-47 variants, and 50 caliber sniper rifles capable of penetrating vehicle armor. These weapons moved across the border in quantity. On the other side of the conflict stood La Línea, the Juarez cartel's enforcement arm, which was substantially made up of serving and former law enforcement personnel who had been co-opted into the criminal payroll. Federal police deployed to the city to restore order also found themselves in the crosshairs of a conflict that was now taking place in streets, markets, and residential neighborhoods. The homicide rate in Ciudad Juarez climbed to levels that drew international attention. It was the deadliest city in the world for a period of several years. The human cost in civilian lives, in displaced families, in the permanent alteration of a city's character was enormous. Guzmán directed this war from the mountains of Sinaloa. In January 2008, as the Juarez conflict continued, the second front opened at home. The Beltrán Leiva brothers, Arturo, Hector, and Alfredo, had been Guzmán's closest allies for nearly 2 decades. Their relationship went back before the Sinaloa Cartel existed in its current form. They came from a hamlet barely any distance from La Tuna. They were, in some senses, almost family. But Alfredo Beltrán Leiva had been causing problems. drawing attention in Culiacan, behaving in ways that Guzmán apparently viewed as reckless. Guzmán told him, through the appropriate channels, to lower his profile. Shortly afterward, in January 2008, Alfredo was arrested by Mexican soldiers. Arturo Beltrán Leiva concluded that Guzmán had provided information to the military. There is reason to believe that was accurate. U.S. State Department sources from that period have suggested as much. Arturo, who was known within the organization for his volatility, declared war on the Sinaloa Cartel. Whether or not Guzmán had engineered the arrest, the conflict it produced cost him personally. On May 8, 2008, his son Edgar Guzmán Lopez, a young man in his early 20s, was with a group of friends in a parking lot in an affluent neighborhood of Culiacan. 5 pickup trucks arrived. More than 20 gunmen got out and opened fire. Edgar and his cousin Cesar Ariel Loera Guzmán were killed. A poorly aimed rocket-propelled grenade struck the side of a nearby supermarket. Those who knew Guzmán in the period afterwards said he was devastated. He reportedly arranged for the purchase of every available flower in Culiacan for his son's funeral. Within days, the Mexican federal government deployed 3,000 soldiers and federal police to Sinaloa in an attempt to contain the escalating violence. Radio antennas used by gang communications were dismantled. Businesses linked to the trade were raided. It did little to stop the fighting. Arturo Beltrán Leiva was killed in December 2009, cornered at a birthday party and then tracked to a second property. His brother Hector took over the faction and continued the offensive. The war on that front ground on. Through all of this, the Juarez conflict, the Sinaloa Civil War, the mountain hiding, the constant movement, Guzmán was running a global enterprise. Life in the mountains of Sinaloa was not what it appeared from the outside. Guzmán moved between approximately half a dozen hideouts spread across Sinaloa and the neighboring state of Durango, constantly relocating when military forces were reported nearby. He traveled with a small household staff, a couple of maids, a secretary, an assistant, and an armed escort of approximately 50 men, some of them equipped with heavy machine guns specifically intended to engage military helicopters. His daily schedule was inverted. He slept until noon. He spent his afternoons working through messages from his secretary, who read them aloud and recorded his responses. He occasionally walked through the mountains to think, armed with a handgun and a rifle. When the military came too close, he moved sometimes on foot, sleeping rough, for several days at a time. The safe houses were functional rather than extravagant. Each had a television, a collection of films, a washer and dryer, and a refrigerator. Luxury goods were avoided not out of principle but out of necessity. Anything ostentatious was a liability in the mountains. The persistent problem was communications. Running an organization that extended from Sinaloa to Chicago to Madrid to Sydney required reliable, secure, and rapid communication. The mountain terrain made that difficult. In 2008, a solution arrived in the form of a young Colombian IT technician named Christian Rodriguez, who worked for one of Guzmán's allied cocaine-producing families, the Cifuentes. Rodriguez arrived at the mountain hideout via a small plane and a makeshift airstrip. He laid the groundwork for an internet cable running from the city of Culiacan into the mountains, with relay antennas positioned at the hideouts. On top of this physical infrastructure, he built an encrypted communications network, a system of internet-based voice and text communications that at the time appeared to offer meaningful protection against surveillance. Guzmán was pleased, but he wanted more. He asked Rodriguez whether it was possible to install monitoring software on the phones of his own people. Rodriguez said yes. The software was called FlexiSpy. It could be loaded onto a mobile phone without the owner's knowledge, and once installed, it gave the person controlling it access to emails, text messages, application data, location information, and the ability to activate the phone's microphone remotely, turning it into a listening device. Guzmán began distributing phones to his wives, his girlfriends, his lieutenants, his associates that had been preloaded with the spyware. He then assigned a secretary to monitor the surveillance network. He would finish a call on the encrypted line, hang up, and then listen to what the other party said next. It was, from a certain angle, an impressive expression of organizational control. From another angle, it was the behavior of a man who had lost confidence in the people around him, who was managing his organization increasingly through surveillance rather than trust. It was also the moment that would eventually destroy him. Christian Rodriguez had not planned to spend his career in the mountains of Sinaloa. He was skilled, young, and aware that his proximity to a major criminal organization created a liability that would grow over time. He had been quietly looking for a way to extract himself and establish a legitimate career in cybersecurity when, in February 2010, he made a serious mistake. He traveled to New York and attempted to sell his spyware capabilities to an individual he believed to be a Russian organized crime figure. The individual was an undercover FBI agent. Rodriguez was not arrested immediately. He was cultivated. Over the following year, Rodriguez became a federal informant. The FBI's primary objective was straightforward. They wanted access to the encrypted communications network he had built for the Sinaloa Cartel. But that access had to be obtained without triggering an alert inside the network. Rodriguez had granted access credentials to some of Guzmán's associates, which meant a sudden change in the system's architecture would be noticed immediately. The solution was elegant. Rodriguez told Guzmán that moving the server hosting the encrypted network from Canada to the Netherlands would improve both security and privacy, a proposition that was technically plausible and commercially reasonable. Guzmán agreed to the migration. As part of the process, all existing encrypted phones in the network had to be replaced with new ones. Rodriguez made copies of the encryption keys for each of the new devices and provided them to the FBI. American investigators now had a window into the interior of one of the most secretive criminal organizations in the world. What they found was revealing. Intercepted communications showed that Guzmán was, in this period, experiencing financial strain. Drug shipments to the United States had been disrupted with increasing frequency from late 2008 onward. The result, it would later emerge, of cooperation between the FBI and two brothers named Pedro and Margarito Flores, who had served as Sinaloa's primary distribution network in the American Midwest, and who had quietly agreed to cooperate with federal authorities in exchange for a way out. The communications also disclosed something more personal. Guzmán was in frequent contact with his wife Emma Coronel Ispuro, with whom he had recently had twin daughters. The messages included practical discussions about the children's schedules and plans for a 6-month birthday celebration. They also included, in one message from January 2012, a reference to giving one of his daughters a cuerno de chiva, a phrase that translated literally as goat's horn and was widely used in narco slang to refer to an AK-47 assault rifle. The affection in the messages was genuine. The context in which it was expressed was not. In the summer of 2011, Guzmán stopped using the encrypted network for sensitive matters. He had grown suspicious. He continued allowing his staff to use it, but for his own communications he switched to a BlackBerry device, believing, incorrectly, that Canadian-based servers could not be accessed by American law enforcement. Rodriguez had connected that BlackBerry to an FBI server. The Americans were still listening. In early 2012, the FBI was monitoring communications between Guzmán and a girlfriend named Agustina Cabanillas Acosta, who handled certain business dealings on his behalf. From those communications, investigators learned that Guzmán had left the mountains and relocated to Los Cabos, the resort city at the southern tip of the Baja California Peninsula. He had rented a property in a gated residential development called Hacienda Encantada, which overlooked the sea. On February 22, 2012, a combined FBI and Mexican law enforcement operation moved into position around the neighborhood. The plan was precise. The execution was not. The Mexican police and tactical unit assigned to the operation arrived more than 2 hours late to the staging point. When they finally deployed, they had been explicitly told which two properties Guzmán was likely to be in. They immediately departed from that guidance and began conducting a house-to-house search of the entire development. The sound of that search reached Guzmán before the officers did. He moved quickly, past the pool, through the patio, across a thick hedge of palm fronds and flowering plants, down a concrete retaining wall at the rear of the property that had not been covered. He reached a car on the other side and was driven to Culiacán before the police had entered his house. The operation's failure had a specific consequence. Christian Rodriguez, whose role had been kept carefully hidden, was now at serious risk of exposure. He was moved to safety in the United States. The FBI needed a new source inside the organization. Andrea Fernandez Velez was in her early 30s, Colombian, and served as the personal secretary of Alex Cifuentes, one of El Chapo's most trusted allies, a Colombian trafficker who operated in close proximity to the Sinaloa leadership. Her position meant she was frequently in the same room as Guzmán during high-level conversations. The FBI had, through the accumulated intercepts and FlexiSpy data, assembled enough evidence against her to support a serious American prosecution. When agents presented her with that evidence, she did not hesitate. She became an informant. At the same time, Guzmán had further hardened his communications security. Messages to him now had to pass through multiple intermediaries. They were conveyed orally to a secretary, who wrote them down, who passed them to a relay, who passed them onward. No written message was directly tied to him, and the multi-layer structure made penetration difficult. But his attachment to his BlackBerry devices remained. He believed the Canadian servers made them untouchable. That belief was wrong, and it was a belief the FBI had no incentive to correct. All they needed, to obtain a wiretap warrant from Canadian authorities, was the relevant phone numbers. Some of those came from Andrea. By 2013 and into 2014, the FBI had mapped a substantial portion of the Sinaloa communications network. Senior figures were being identified and arrested in sequence. Even as his organization was being gradually dismantled around him, Guzmán remained focused on business, planning new product lines with El Mayo, overseeing shipments to Australia and Europe, managing supplier relationships in South America. He had moved out of the mountains by this point. He was living in a series of unremarkable houses in Culiacán, safe houses that were connected to one another and to the city's sewage system by a network of underground tunnels. The houses were referred to within the organization by numbers. On the night of February 16, 2014, the FBI-led investigation arrived at its critical moment. The party was in an upscale neighborhood of Culiacán. Nariz, the nickname of one of Guzmán's senior secretaries, was hosting it. Mexican Marines acting on intelligence gathered from the BlackBerry intercepts moved in and arrested him. Nariz was brought in for questioning. He told his captors that his boss was at safe house number 3. FBI agent Victor Vasquez knew this was a lie. Earlier that day, he had seen an intercepted text in which Nariz had arranged for birria, a traditional goat stew popular in the region, to be delivered to safe house number 5 the following morning. Vasquez mentioned the word. Nariz's expression confirmed what his words had tried to hide. Marines moved quietly toward safe house number 5. Vehicles were parked to block the surrounding streets. Spike strips were placed at key exit points. The perimeter was in place before dawn. At approximately 4 o'clock in the morning, with Guzmán's presence confirmed through his own text messages, a team of Marines approached the front door and swung a steel battering ram against it. The door did not move. 9 minutes of sustained effort were required before it finally gave way. Inside the master bathroom, they found a bathtub that did not look like other bathtubs. Guzmán, who had been asleep with a girlfriend and been woken by Condor, another secretary, at the first sounds of the assault, had reached the bathroom and activated a hidden switch. The bathtub rose on a hydraulic mechanism, revealing a set of wooden stairs descending into the floor. His small group, the girlfriend, the maid, Condor, filed in. The tub lowered behind them. They reached a reinforced steel door and spent a tense moment rotating the wheel mechanism that controlled it. The door opened just as the Marines broke through the front entrance. They ran. Below them, the Marines entered the bathroom. They heard footsteps in the tunnel. They threw a concussion grenade down the stairwell. They did not follow. For an hour, Guzmán and his companions waded through the sewage system that connected the safe houses to the broader city network, the water reaching their waists. When they emerged through a drainage outlet, a lieutenant named Picudo was waiting. He drove them to another location. Guzmán put on clothes for the first time since being woken and made for Mazatlan, a coastal resort town approximately 200 kilometers to the south. By evening, the Marines had Picudo. The next morning, after a night in a government staging location, American operatives and Mexican Marines arrived at the Hotel Miramar in Mazatlan, a 12-story hotel facing the Pacific. They moved through it floor by floor. On the 4th floor, they found a room that had been barricaded from the inside. Inside, Guzmán was with Emma Coronel, their 2 daughters, and Condor. He was armed. It was Emma who spoke first, calling through the barricaded door and asking the Marines not to harm the children. He put down the rifle and surrendered. The capture made international headlines. Guzmán was transferred to the Federal Social Readaptation Center No. 1, the Altiplano prison, with the understanding that the security failures of 2001 would not be repeated. President Enrique Peña Nieto had publicly declared that allowing such an escape again would be unforgivable. The preparations for the second escape began within months of the arrest. From prison, Guzmán communicated through his attorney and through his wife Emma, using them to pass instructions to his sons on the outside. In April 2014, just 2 months after his capture, a property and warehouse approximately 1 kilometer from the prison perimeter was purchased. Workers began digging. The tunnel they excavated over the following 14 months was a more sophisticated structure than anything Guzmán had built before. It ran for just over a kilometer, following a line traced by GPS data transmitted from a watch that had been smuggled into the prison, a watch that tracked Guzmán's precise location within the facility, allowing workers to aim their tunnel at the exact cell rather than the general area. The tunnel was lit throughout its length. It was ventilated. Oxygen supplies were stationed at intervals. A motorcycle mounted on a rail track ran along its floor. The cost was estimated at approximately $5 million. At 8:52 in the evening on July 11, 2015, cameras recorded Guzmán pacing his cell. He moved to the shower, crouched near a partition wall, and was gone in 4 seconds. He dropped approximately 3 feet to a ladder made from PVC pipe, descended roughly 30 feet to the tunnel floor, got on the motorcycle behind a waiting driver, and was carried at speed out of the facility. He was met outside by a vehicle that drove him to a waiting aircraft. The aircraft flew him to Sinaloa. He was out. The investigation that had very nearly caught him in 2012 and had caught him in 2014 resumed almost immediately. Guzmán had not stopped using BlackBerry devices. The technology that his organization had been relying on for years, the same technology the FBI had been reading for years, was still in use, and cooperation between Mexican and American law enforcement was now substantially more sophisticated than it had been at any prior point. In his first weeks out, Guzmán survived one close call that was notable in its details. He was forced to flee through a gully while holding an infant, as a police helicopter descended toward his location. Even for a man practiced at escape, the dynamics had changed. The intercepted BlackBerry traffic placed him, in January 2016, at a house in Los Mochis, the northernmost significant city in Sinaloa. At 4:30 in the morning on January 8, 2016, Mexican Marines entered the property. Immediate gunfire. Guzmán and a loyal associate known as Cholo Ivan moved to a closet at the rear of the house and through another escape tunnel. They surfaced in daylight, commandeered a white Volkswagen, abandoned it when it broke down a few blocks later, and commandeered a second vehicle. About 12 miles southeast of the city, they reached a federal police checkpoint. The officers at the checkpoint recognized the man in the passenger seat. Guzmán was taken into custody for the third and final time in Mexico. Within days, the extradition process, which his legal team had been fighting for years, was set in motion. He attempted from custody to organize one more tunnel escape and reportedly offered a $2 million bribe to a senior prison official to be transferred back to a facility where the operation might work. Neither effort succeeded. He was moved between prisons in a deliberate pattern designed to prevent any fixed plan from taking hold. On January 17, 2017, Joaquín Guzmán was escorted to a private aircraft that flew him to Long Island MacArthur Airport in Islip, New York. As the plane touched down, he could be seen through a porthole window. He was looking out at the United States. He was crying. The trial that followed was a significant event in American legal history, not for its verdict, which was never seriously in doubt, but for the evidence it surfaced. Over the course of 11 weeks in federal court in Brooklyn, the prosecution presented testimony from former cartel members, former government officials, intercepted communications, and financial records. The picture that emerged was of an organization that had, over approximately 3 decades, moved hundreds of tons of narcotics into the United States, generated revenue in the tens of billions of dollars, corrupted officials at every level of the Mexican government, and used violence with systematic calculation. Andrea Fernandez Velez, the Colombian secretary who had spent years feeding intelligence to the FBI while remaining inside the organization, was among those who testified. It had cost her. The cartel had discovered her role and had arranged for her to be killed. She had been extracted in time, but the knowledge of what she had narrowly avoided was with her. She gave her testimony. When she finished, she was weeping. Guzmán, seated at the defense table, did not appear to be listening. He was looking at his wife Emma, who sat in the gallery. He gave her a thumbs up. He smiled. On July 17, 2019, he was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years, with forfeiture orders attached. Just before the sentence was delivered, he made a statement to the court complaining about the conditions of his confinement, the isolation, the constant surveillance, what he described as psychological and emotional torment during his time in American custody. The lead prosecutor, Gina Parlovecchio, addressed this directly. She observed, calmly and without embellishment, that over the course of his career, the defendant had not demonstrated a discernible capacity for remorse. He was led from the courtroom. The United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, known as ADX Florence, sits in the high desert of south-central Colorado, approximately 90 miles south of Denver. It is the highest security federal correctional facility in the country. The standard cell at ADX is roughly 7 by 12 feet. The walls are reinforced concrete. There is a small window positioned to allow natural light without providing a view of anything that could orient a prisoner geographically. The cell contains a concrete bed with a thin mattress, a fixed desk and stool, a toilet, a sink, and a shower. A television is mounted on the wall. It receives only educational and religious programming. Prisoners are confined to these cells for 23 hours each day. Contact with other inmates is minimal or non-existent. For a man with Guzmán's history, the standard ADX protocols were considered insufficient. He was assigned to a section of the facility known as Range 13, which applies restrictions beyond the already severe standard regime. Surveillance is continuous. Phone calls are limited to 1 or 2 15-minute calls per month. Physical contact with visitors on those rare occasions when visitation occurs is restricted or prohibited. Since his arrival, Guzmán has filed a series of legal complaints about his conditions. In 2022, his attorneys reported that he was being denied adequate dental care and consistent access to clean water. In 2023, he sent a message to the President of Mexico describing what he characterized as psychological torment and requesting that he be permitted to serve his sentence in a Mexican facility on humanitarian grounds. The request was not granted. In April 2024, a request for telephone access and visits from Emma Coronel and their daughters was denied by prison officials. The legal strategy being pursued on his behalf, aimed at a reduced sentence or altered conditions, has faced a specific obstacle. Prison administrators have, at various points, restricted his access to legal materials, citing concerns that document access could be exploited as part of a planning process for another escape attempt. Whether that concern reflects a genuine assessed risk or an institutional reflex, it has had the effect of making the already difficult task of mounting a legal challenge from inside ADX Florence close to impossible. Joaquín Guzmán was born into a Mexico in which the narcotics trade was not an aberration but a feature, a regulated system embedded in the structure of rural life, managed through corruption from above and sustained through poverty from below. He did not create that system. He emerged from it and expanded it on a scale that its architects could not have imagined. The world he built operated through fear, money, and logistical precision. For 3 decades, it sustained itself against the sustained efforts of 2 governments, dozens of law enforcement agencies, and the repeated attempts of rival organizations to destroy it. It ran cocaine and heroin and methamphetamine across borders on a scale that shaped markets and statistics and mortality rates in cities far from any mountain in Sinaloa. What ended it was not, ultimately, a single investigation or a single arrest. It was a series of small decisions, a trusted technician who sought a way out, a communication system that was never as secure as it was believed to be, and an unwillingness or inability to change patterns that had been compromised years before they led to a cell door closing permanently. He is 68 years old. He is in a concrete room. He is watched at all hours. In La Tuna, the house he built for his mother still stands at the center of the village. His sons run what remains of the organization he built. The trade continues. The mountains, as always, endure.